I thought I'd just show sort of some. Oh, you want to do that right now? Oh, okay. Sorry, I've already destroyed the order of the evening.
I'll just do a real quick.
I've been demoted.
All right, I'll just do a real quick some introductions that we normally do up front. So I wanted to first introduce and recognize the Field School Committee, who has worked really hard to pull all of this together, and that includes Diamond Barrera, Chris Mice, Clint Lacey, our treasurer. It includes Ron Ralph. There you are. It includes Antonio Padilla, and of course Sylvia and Barbara and Donna. We all have to thank them for their hard work at registration. Jack Tool, of course, one of our hardest working non-official committee members. And then Ron Ralph has another very important series of introductions to make for our cooks this year.
Thank you, folks. This is my life. Can you hear me back? Oh, you can't hear anything? Well, too bad. Move on. Well, as you know, Napoleon said that an army moves on its belly. And archaeology is no different. You don't get fed, you don't work hard. So we're going to expect a lot of good hard work tomorrow because we have the best cooks in town. At this point, I'd like to introduce them to you. And so we're right here, they're going to wave. Mama is first. Mary Ann Hughes. And next to her is Linda Washington. And the spark plug of the outfit is Janice Hinojosa. And last but not least, Rory Riley. Thank you for that applause. And eat hard.
I have just a couple of quick other announcements to make. I wanted to also announce that the merchandising sales will be here from 5 to 6:30, Monday through Wednesday, and starting tomorrow, she'll be accepting credit cards. And so I wanted to introduce. TAS Field School always hopes to work with a local organization that is local to the archaeological site and the campground where we're going to be coming into. And look at us, we kind of take over, don't we? But, we really, really need the help and all the preparation and background work that a local arrangements group can put together. And we've worked with some great ones over the years, but I have to say, that the Hill Country Archaeological Association has been one of the best local arrangements partners that we've ever had. And so I'd like to introduce the current president of Hcaa, Mike Mcbride. One more announcement too. Well, two more announcements real quick. Crying Woman site tours are on Wednesday, and there's a sign-up sheet over here. It's a pretty significant, fantastic new archaeological site west of Bear Creek Ranch that we're offering tours on. There's only 5 out of 15 spots filled right now. Get them while they're at. And we also have a teacher meeting for teachers, hoping for certification credits or teacher credits at 4 p.m. on Monday in the pavilion. There you go, Mike.
Just a real quick thank you for everybody turning out. This is a great crowd. I mean, One of the missions of the organization is exactly this, as far as field archaeology, getting folks together, public outreach, and like Tiffany said, the members that took part in bringing all this together. There were really two people who are our leaders, and one is Steve Sotomayor, who took care of a lot of the field stuff. And many of y'all know Terry Farley. As far as advertising, if y'all see Terry, give her a big thank you, because she has really done a lot of the advertising, a lot of the background work, and done a great job. So there again, welcome. And if you guys are thinking, boy, these guys are lucky to live and work out here, you're right.
Yeah, Jack, okay. Oh, good. I agree, that's necessary.
Folks, especially if you live in Flat Rock, we have to leave that county lock available. If we have an emergency, the emergency people have keys to get in. They have the county key. They don't have our combination. I've given some of them, but I don't know how they spread the word. But anyway, how are you?
Changes like this.
And it has a padlock, a lock that takes a key. It has a padlock on one end, just like this. When you lock the gate, you have to go around the post and then around the gate. You have the padlock here. You've got our combination here. You have to go through the padlock with our combination, put it on the chain, so they're both available. This is very important. It really is. So y'all, if you have any questions, I can give you a personal demonstration. So you can get through.
Thank you.
I wish I knew that one 20 years ago. I saw that Steve made a copy of that, so we might want to keep using that one. But so today was an excellent day. It was hot, and I really appreciate everybody seemed to get in the swing of it once figured out what I did with the forums and stuff. So that's much appreciated. And most people have broken through the crust, and we're starting to find more artifacts. And right here, I think this is from area 8. Josh, this is from your area. And we were thinking, probably pedernales point in terms of. And as vehicles go, I think Sergio is apt that this is basically the F-150 of Texas horns. That is the most common and probably most useful and all around. So that's we are starting to find things. Let's see. This is more my failure in technology here. And then Mcbride. This was from your area, wasn't it? The King? No, it was area B. D. Oh, I'm sorry, Brian. That was yours. Yes, I'm sorry. So it looks like it looks pretty much like a King knife like that. And then I think today's award goes to the most. So these are made of copper. They look like they're copper, and I think they are, or typically identified as tinklers, as sort of bells and tinklers. So they're making a tinkling sound. Yes, and you know, at the hotel I was able to get internet, so there's an example of a tinkler. That one's from Virginia, but it's almost the same size, and it's just not crushed. So, Francoise, that was your spectacular find. It wasn't a tuna can. So, well done. And usually, it was in Area B. Area B. So, Tina, is Tina here? No, I'm not. So she just, I give her the credit for that, but she's not here. So it's her hard-working crew. Yes, they did a great job on it. And since they usually, I'm going to start with, does the lab have anything they want to bring up in comments or anything like that? Is Mary Beth here?
She said she probably couldn't make it.
Because I was going to introduce her or something? I know, is there, yes. Anybody else want to speak on behalf of the lab?
Bring us samples.
What kind of samples? Careful what you wish for. All right, sterile samples or what? I mean, we'll bring some. Oh, okay. No, we're going to start sampling. We just haven't got into deposits that are requiring a bunch of sampling, but we can. Marvin and I are going to generate some samples for you all. All right, so we'll work on that. So, historic site. Mr. Ron Ralph, again. Now I feel bad.
I feel like I'm hogging the show here. Can I get my crew chiefs to stand up? Sarah, Diane, Mr. Schmidt, Miss Lacey. Thank you, guys. We're doing a good job out there considering it's day 2. We've already defined 2 of the 4 corners of the schoolhouse, and we've got a pretty good idea of where the dance hall corners are. We had Julius Neinhofer, the owner, come out and say, well, before it burnt down, it was from here to here, there to there. So we've got it pretty well bolted. We're sticking in units, and I think we're going to do real well. Also found what's called the picnic area. When they weren't up in the top dancing and going to school, there was an area down the hill, down by the creek, where they had some rocks laid out, a big tall live oak tree, and they would sit there and eat their dinner, evidently. And we found some glass on the uphill side and some bottle caps on the downhill side. So we figured they popped the cap, threw it downhill, set the bottom up on the rock and shot it. So we got lots of good activity. So if y'all have a chance to come out to look at our historic site, you're more than welcome. One more announcement. Tomorrow, Monday, we're going to start a tech site workshop. If you haven't heard about it, talk to me, talk to somebody. But if you'd like to learn how to put tech site into a computer so that it can be generated from the Texas Archeological Research Laboratory, we're going to do a show and tell. It's going to be at 2 o'clock to about 4:30 at Shiner University. The upside is it's air conditioned. It is really cool. So if you want, give me a call. If you have a computer, that helps. If you have a computer that has access, that helps. If you have a computer that already has tech site, that's even the best. Come on by if you feel like it. We'll show you how to input tech site into a computer.
Thank you, Ron, for that Binfordian explanation of activity there at the site. So I think you got it pretty much nailed down on the bottle caps. We'll be looking for the Ron Ralph pitch diameter or something like that. So the next is the youth group. I didn't bring up the youth group last time. Doug? They are the hardest working.
Hi there. We had 29 kids and 26 adults today, so that's a sizable chunk of the field school. Parents who bring your kids, thank you, thank you, thank you. That's the future of Texas archaeology. We appreciate you bringing them out, introducing them to what we do, and helping the future of the state of Texas in archaeology. If you are working with the youth group as an adult and the older kids who are with us who are supervising, please stand up. Just want to recognize everyone and say thank you, thank you, thank you. It's hard work sometimes, keeping everything going, but we certainly appreciate you guys taking the time to do all that with us. My only announcement is we will be taking a field trip. The youth group will be going to the Roberts Ranch, the YMCA Roberts Ranch on Wednesday, and we'll be gone all day. We have handouts to give to parents that tells you a little bit about it and what your kids need to bring, just the hats, hiking boots and stuff. We're going to be doing some nature walks and they're going to be doing some activities. They've already started an earth oven, cooking some plants in the ground, and they're going to be opening that up for us on Wednesday when we're there. So it's going to be a fun trip, and we'll get information out to you. But so your kids will need to have a signed form if they're coming, or if you're an adult who's coming, we'll have to have a form signed for you as well. So we're going to be talking to parents at the site, and if you're not working with the kids, come see us so that we can get you to get one of those signed forms for them. Thank you.
Thank you, Bill. And does the survey team have anything they want to, Chris Mines? Does the survey team have anything they want to add or discuss? Are they still out? Wow. Yeah. And I guess that brings us back to the prehistoric components. Part of the site is Josh. Is Josh here? Who am I kidding? No, he's not here. But yeah, well, that's it. But do the Area A, the Area A crew chiefs stand up? Robert. So they're working hard in the sheep dip, and they're finding some real interesting things. So that's it. One of the they have what it's a possible aeroplane. I need to have Sergio look at it because it's a little unusual, and there's a chance it may be a fragment of an aeroplane. So that doubles the number of aeroplanes from it. That changes the whole interpretation of the site. Really. So, Tina, I think we established Tina is not here. Tina is not here. Are there any Area B crew chiefs here? You're not going to say, oh, thanks. But Area B, that's she's basking in her tinkler discovery. But like I said, that was a great recognition because there are there's metal fragments and stuff like that out there, and that's pretty easy to disregard but I know the eagle eyes in the lab would have caught that for sure. So.
We should recognize Chris Lentz as the one who could recognize.
That is true. It is. Chris Lentz said, what are y'all doing out here? This is exactly what it is. So yeah, thank you, Chris, for not shaming us. It was tactfully pointed out to us. So very well done. So we appreciate it, Chris. And that brings us to Brian Jameson. You had that. Do you want to have your crew chief stand up? Yeah, and the digging's getting great over there. You've got the premier shade set up as well, but the points are going to start just flying out of the ground pretty well after they're properly documented. But they will be coming out of the ground any day now, so anytime. Well, hopefully the appropriate time period. So. But that, so yeah, I'm really appreciative of what the hard work everybody's done so far. It's a lot smoother than it was yesterday, and that's not your all fault. Y'all got right in there and started moving dirt, and I know you're going to enjoy it a lot more. As I want to point out, Marvin, after we dug and everything like that, he got 2 miles of hose and hooked it up, and he's irrigated everything out there. So it's going to be. You're probably only going to dig like, you're going to dig 3 or 4 hours each tomorrow. It would be so nice. We appreciate it. Here's Steve. And I'll get out of the way and pass it on to Steve on a serious part of the program.
Okay, before I introduce tonight's speaker, I just want to tell you about one thing that one of our lady members brought to my attention this morning, and that is what's going on right down here on the perimeter of our park. You haven't noticed that there's a backhoe, a skid steer bobcat, and a screen and a crew of people digging up a midden. So the first concern she had was, this doesn't look really good. And the first concern I had was, are they on county property or are they on private property? Make a long story short, I called one of the county commissioners who is in charge of this area. It is private property, so they have every right to do that. I had a discussion with them this afternoon. It was all very friendly. It's actually for a pretty good cause. They're raising money for the American Legion. But tomorrow, in the regular weekly meeting of the county commissioners, this particular commissioner is going to bring it to the court's attention that activity is not affiliated with our field school TAS group. The newspapers are always there, the media's there, so it will get out. So I think we'll be coming.
Do you think if they're going to bring them, we do our artifact identification later this week, do you think they'll be bringing those artifacts in for us to identify, so later they can say that professional archaeologists have certified what they are, so they can sell them for more money?
I do not know. I will recognize them when I see them. And if they do something like that, they're committing fraud. If they, for instance, if they advertise that we have certified this artifact.
I say that because that has happened to me and another organization, and my name was put on it because I was asked to large event, and I said I was identifying it, but did not know that they were members. They told me they had just found this in their yard, and what they did later was go online and use my name and not certified. So just something we need to watch for if they show up for that identification.
No, that's a very good point. I appreciate that. And I'll be here and I do recognize them. So, and there'll be several of our group that will be doing artifact identification. I'll talk to all of them about that. Thank you.
We don't need them here.
Okay, tonight's speaker, I'm going to introduce, many of you know Sergio Ayala. Sergio is a prehistoric and experimental archaeologist at the Galt School of Archaeological Research at the Texas Archeological Research Laboratory at the University of Texas, Austin. You get all that? Yeah. All right, good. Sergio got his bachelor's in anthropology at Texas State University, and he currently now is in the doctoral program at the University of Exeter in the United Kingdom. He tells me that he is probably within months of finishing and receiving his PhD. got a very interesting talk tonight, I think. He is doing archaeology, he's doing criminal archaeology, in a particular field of lithics that probably not many, if any, archaeologists are working with. So please welcome Sergio Ayala.
Finding a good position here is going to be hard. I don't want to block such a big screen. Admittedly, this will be a little tough. There's some things, obviously, that won't be clear on the screen. I'll try to walk through those things. But basically, what I do, let's see here. Yeah, it looks like I'm good in the shower. That's okay. Yeah, so what is experimental archaeology? Basically, what I do at UT and what I do at the Galt School is basically use experimental work and replicative work as a way to extract the behaviors that are in lithic tools and byproducts of lithic tools. Now, that's pretty tedious stuff, and some people say, oh, well, you're just a flint knapper. And although there has been just a huge explosion of flint napping, I would say over the last couple of decades, that is not sort of really what I do. Flint napping is part of it, but in terms of a laboratory or an academic sense, it's basically this whole totality of work where you look at a component of a site or an assemblage of a site, and then you use that as your reference guide to try to not only replicate final products, but you try to replicate the actual trash that comes off of making the final products. And so, you might have heard, some people might have told you during some digging today, or maybe you looked at some literature, you might hear some terms like diagnostics or diagnostic play, or something like that. And so, in my work, when you're trying to replicate diagnostics, part of that is actually replicating specific type of plates that come off of certain technologies. For instance, a Clovis point. There are certain things that come off of Clovis points because it's a specific stringent system of how you make a Clovis point. It's not just an outline. There's a plating technology to it. So it's a real tedious process. But what I'm going to do today is kind of talk about why I do that and a little bit of how I do that, and I think where lithics research can go in the future, at least to sort of expand its perspectives and its methods and so on, so we can get back to or more into what we should have started, or what we've always been trying to get at, and that's the human behavior. Getting at the human behavior from the material culture that we are investigating. So there's tons and tons and millions of pieces of artifacts that come from sites all the time, but how are we treating them, right? In terms of methods, how are we treating it in terms of analysis in the laboratory, and what are we saying about the ancient individual and their societies based on these methods? So I'm going to talk a little bit about that. So basically, what I'm saying is that, well, it's kind of funny staring at all those boxes back there, just enormous amounts of archaeological literature and site reports and so on. And if you were to peruse through all these site reports and look at the lithics report sections, and then, what style or what approach of lithic analysis is it going to look like? What's it going to be? And pretty much most of it is going to be, or 98% of it is going to be morphological description. Right? And Erik was just explaining to me how he's tired of looking at tables. and of course that's sort of necessary, organization and getting your classes of materials. It's a standard part of practice. But it also relates to how we think about, the material, how we look at material culture and the methods that we use. So I'm just going to throw a pictures on the screen here kind of point out what I mean. So if I put a couple of images like that on the screen, usually the propensity is, what is that? What do you call it? What type is that? Anybody know? I know Lassen is already thinking, or he has a very good idea of one of the true chiefs. But so what I'm getting at here is that we go very strongly to identifying something, giving it a name by its shape in relation to some other shapes. But from a behavioral or technologist perspective, what is much more interesting, actually, is how it came to be. So what are all those behaviors that relate to stone source acquisition, right? Where did the stone come from? What is the type of flaking technology? What's going on the cognitive level to take abstract design into material form? So the experimental work is the process of looking at the flake technology and then trying to match those flake scars, look at all the cross sections, longitudinally, laterally, and so on, and trying to replicate that for the reasons of understanding strategy and technique systems and all of that, and those kinds of things, the behaviors that make something so. So I know sometimes people throw a bunch of points at me and say, what is that, what is that? Please tell me what it is, and all these kind of things, and I frustrate people because I'm silent forever. Because I'm not a typologist. I'm looking at the behaviors out of all these artifacts, and I'm kind of going through this mental system of analyzing it, and so on and so forth. So I'm really slow to type things. Let's see here. So basically, this is just a really quick window into like how I think about stone tool technology. So something like this, I'm thinking, oh, wow, look how they're like leveraging the edges to get certain like flake lengths, flake widths, and so on, what's going on. And very quickly, like looking at the negative spaces, I outlined a couple of scars on the light colored one there to show what I mean, like off of those margins, off the edges. And so I'm thinking, okay, it looks like some sort of punch work or indirect work, of what kind, and so on. Is it like some sort of like, tine, antler tine? Is it maybe a soft stone, sandstone punch kind of work? So then I have to go to the shop and experiment a whole bunch of times until I start getting close to matching those flake scars and so on. So I just did that really quickly just to kind of get you in my head a little bit before we go down the rabbit hole. So basically what I'm doing is more of this marginal practice, which is based in technological behaviors and experimental work. What most people are accustomed to is basically the more descriptive, the more morphological, statistical way to separate things by patterns and shapes. It's a very kind of different thing. And so when it comes to site interpretation, right, when it comes to understanding, say, technologies, of any time period in space and so on, I much more favor getting into the details of the behaviors than the more general statistical stuff that is more, the inferences you can make are a little bit more broad on a general level. So what I'm going to talk about tonight, can everybody hear me? I want to make sure these are, okay, some thumbs up in the back, all right. I'm going to do a couple of case studies, just go through real quick to kind of show how this is applied in actual archaeological lithic assemblage. So what I'm going to do is go through a couple of caches, and one reason for selecting those is that they're small, kind of more like an event. One person, or maybe two people did it at one moment in time, and then they were buried for various reasons. And it's a small assemblage, and it kind of helps me explain these things. And actually, some of this stuff will be in publication really soon. So the Lizardville cache, who's been a big thing? Okay, so beautiful area. Oh, hey, nice to see you guys. The Big Bend area
The Center for Big Bend Studies, our group, discovered this cache in 2006. And the, let me go back to this image. The artifacts that were in this cache had basically sat in a filing cabinet from that time to about 2014. But the whole find is quite extraordinary. Kind of imagine a little hill in the middle of nowhere, and there being like a small boulder cairn on top of it. And then inside that, you have this polished limestone cobble on top. And actually there's one underneath it that you can't see there. And then in between that is two polished clams where the interiors were perforated. And then inside that are 13 dart points. Not exactly a whimsical burial. And then outside of the hill are these circular large pavement features around the hill. And then 90 meters away from the hill is another huge boulder feature in a chevron shape pointing to the hill. Or at least the chevron is, how else do you say it? It's pointing at the hill. So the context is really, really interesting. But one of the things that puzzled Andy Cloud, the director of the Center for Big Bend Studies, was that the running sort of consensus or the common sense of the time was that the artifacts that were in the cache basically were considered to be a single technology. And basically you have these really nice ones kind of in the middle, and some would look a little bit different. And Andy threw them on the table. He said, these have been here in my cabinet forever. What do you think of that? Or these guys? And when he threw them on the table, I shouldn't say throw, that's bad. But what immediately struck me was how thin they were, like pretty much all of them. I mean, you have some that are through here that are more early in their phases of reduction. Let me put up some of the thickness on these things here. So some of these are like wafer thin, 4.7, 4.5 millimeters thick, and so on. But immediately also I could see differences in the flaking technology. So I said, Andy, what are you going to do with these? I can tell you right now, that's not one single technology in this cache. And he said, well, write up a little report and tell me what you think. So he allows me to take them back to the lab over here in Central Texas. And, I run it through a bunch of rounds of breaking rock and trying a whole bunch of stuff. And basically, what I came to realize is, wow, I know this can't be read. This is a little bit of a window into my note recording for each artifact. I go through all these behavioral things that I check for presence and absence on. But I'm not going to go through that in any kind of detail here. Let me just go through this. That's kind of a table of my notes. So basically what I realized was that you're basically looking at a whole continuum of reduction, and there's clearly a indirect percussion punch technology that is occurring on the bipeds. Anybody not know what indirect punch percussion is? I get in my nerdy world and I forget, wait a minute, nobody's ever like busted off and listen to some nerd like me on this. So, when you are reducing a raw piece of stone, either by another mineral stone or by antler, and you're just striking it directly, that's direct percussion. However, you can also use two pieces of stone or a piece of stone and the antler, hit the antler and the antler hits the stone, and that's more of an indirect approach. Okay, and the reason one might do that, there are several, but one of the main reasons why it's very useful to go indirect is because a lot of error that happens from freehand hitting the raw piece of stone is taken away by using an indirect approach, because you can put the antler or the tine directly on the area you want to hit, and then hit that object. Does that make sense? So There's some precision to it that it happens when you go to an indirect approach. So based on the flake scars, I kind of suspected that, like, based on my experience and so on in previous years of doing other technology. It looks like some sort of punch percussion that's going on. So I tried a whole bunch of stuff, and I'm trying to like nail down what's going on. And so basically, through these punch percussion techniques, they're really controlling the midline, they're really doing these deliberate, short, broad, flaking approaches as a thinning process and a shaping process all at the same time. So there's not a lot of fiddling or pressure flaking or not. We're doing everything by this indirect approach. And these so-called preforms for the really nice ones actually are their own technology. All of that is deliberate. That is a complete design, self-contained technology in that piece, and the same with this one. But back to what is really, really cool. And those clamshells is basically a whole reduction system of that technology. So for somebody like me, it's kind of interesting to see that laid out before. He's like, oh, now I understand this technology because I have from early stage all the way to finished product, which is a rare thing. So now the expertise that's in these final products and in this chipping, it makes you wonder, well, why did they not go ahead and finish these other ones that have only taken a few minutes? So, and in the context of the cache burial itself, there's nothing sort of like whimsical. Everything is so deliberate, so time intensive, so there's so much investment going on. That seems very conscious and deliberate to put that whole continuum in there. And that's pretty fascinating. So, these used to be called Mcbride points. They sort of were declassified into being preforms for Langtree. However, Langtree has a completely different flaking technology from this. You can't go from these midline, you could say, can you see a little shadow going here? Okay, so the flaking technology that they're doing and the way they support it in the hand, they're consciously, deliberately thinning it to the midline. It's not accidental. So the way they control the shape and the thickness and cross-section, everything is deliberate. And Langtree technology, that is absolutely not what you're doing. You're actually treating the edges in your platforms in a completely different way to drive flakes really long and flat. So you wind up with faces that are very flat, not having any midlines. So if you were to try to make this a preform to get to here, you're going to have zero success. That's basically what I'm saying. This is a different technology. So my suggestion here is that in terms of this cache, Mcbride is definitely, it should be put back on the map as a formal technological class. As far as Langtree, those that know, like these sites here, I'm sure if people went back to these sites from the 50s and 60s and so on, that we could find early phases of the Langtree technology. There's no doubt about that. And those that are more familiar with archaeology in the Trans-Pecos, basically in the Middle Archaic, there's just a huge fluorescence of other contracting stem points of the Middle Archaic. And Mcbride and Langtree are just kind of a part of that. So basically, I think we need an investment of sort of these kinds of approaches so that we can get into the nitty-gritty and make separations that are sort of like empirically adequate from a technological perspective, and not just out of outlines. And obviously, it's very easy to make completed points as preforms and preforms as completed points. And we can make confusions if we don't understand the technologies. So a lot of this stuff that's a little too hard to read in this situation. I'm just going to kind of move on to the case studies. So here's another small cache. and we're gonna have to move geographically way up near Oklahoma and the Red River Valley. So in the Great Depression era, there was a important figure in Montague County. He was a judge by the name of Jobin. And during that time period, he would tell all the local kids that if they went out around the neighborhood and in the creeks and brought them a point, he'd give them a nickel or something. Well, it didn't take long for him to amass an enormous collection, which he actually built a whole wing on his ranch to store all that stuff. Well, in the midst of that was a find along Denton Creek in the county, and that's what I'm going to talk about. So, just generally about this time period, which this technology relates to, the Andice point technology. This takes us back to sort of like the terminus of the early Archaic and the onset of the middle Archaic. It's somewhere right in there, or as Dr. Collins used to tell me, you got one barb over the point in the early Archaic and the other barb over the point in the middle Archaic. You know. But basically, there seems to be some sort of climatic deviation going on at this time, and at this period of time, we're seeing more evidence of bison in archaeological sites. So this event of this technology appearing seems to coincide with bison in the southern plains in much bigger numbers. That also relates to a cooling event that's going on at this time. So this horizon in time is called the Calf Creek Horizon. That's kind of what we refer to this time period in archaeology. It's more like a short event. It's almost like Clovis. You know, it appeared, spread really quickly, huge geographic range, but it also kind of dissolved for some reason very quickly. So there's a time period of like 200 or 300 years and it disappears. So one thing about these points is the extraordinary precision and consistency between them. It's so precise that I could stack every one of these bifaces on top of each other, and the stems and the hafting areas on these points, you could stare down through them almost like they just went through a machine. They're just so precise. And anybody who's done any experimental work, either with a bunch of people on a single technology or yourself on a single technology, it's extremely hard to be that precise. Being that precise with multiple people with the idiosyncratic stuff that is just different with different body types and the way they use toolkits. This, to me, is clearly the work of a single individual at a moment in time. I'm not going to spend much time on the metrics here, but you can see the lengths and the size of these things. Now it's near 21 centimeters long. This one near 18. A couple of them have their distal portions snapped off. Part of that was like a crystalline inclusion that weakened it, so when they were doing the notching in the base, that sort of oscillation that goes through it snapped during the notching process, and that's the profanity moment. So again, I because this technology is also really, really difficult to do, I had to bring in some extra firepower for it, and did 10 rounds of experiments and a whole lot of mistakes, but some really good successes and some conclusions here, basically about the cache. Now, the first thing about them is when you handle them and see them directly, all of them have equal polish and smoothing on them. And some of them have cortex remnants on both sides. So that is pretty interesting. So the flake ridges, or we call them irises, there's a polish on them, and those that have cortex remnants on both sides, meaning they came from really flat, large nodules of superb chert, that they didn't remove. It was so worn and polished and smooth, it almost was like greasy smooth. And each of these bifaces had that equally. So it kind of suggested I should probably do some useware and halfware, a microscopic analysis on it if I could. Because my working hypothesis was, well, maybe like some other preforms of bifaces that we've seen in Texas archaeology, maybe they traveled in a pouch as preforms, and that's how they got their wear over time. So, maybe kind of go through some of these things here. So basically, I had Maryland at UT get me started on the halfware and the useware. 0 useware on all of them. What was really surprising was the halfware. The halfware was intense. It was really, really strong polish and striations from halfware, but it didn't go the length of the stem. It went 80% the length of the points. So like really deeply set half technology there. And that brings me, let me go back to the image of these guys. And that gets me to these things here. See those? There's some little notchings on the margins. Those definitely puzzled me. They still puzzle me. But perhaps because they were so deeply hafted, they might have been leveraged as part of the binding process as the pitch and other things was curing and drying and so on. It's just a hypothesis at this point. As far as like the microscopic analysis on those things, the notching, both on the margins and the notching in the base, is the very last thing that did happen on the bifaces. So you have all the polish, you have all the smoothing and everything, but on the edges you have no useware, and in those notching flake scars, it's all fresh and very sharp and angular. So those happen at the very, very, very end. So the working hypothesis is that these cherts, which were XRF and isotopically confirmed to be Edwards, definitely did not come from the Red River Valley. They came from different places in Texas. They're not all the same type. So there was quite an investment of getting them. And also you can kind of see it here. You can kind of see some coloration changes. And when you look at them directly, you can see a lot of gloss and reddish hue changes in the chert, which I would say is a pretty good bit of evidence for heat treatment. So what I think happened is the stone source material started somewhere in the central Texas area, perhaps maybe a little further north, and the preforming happened there. But in order to get the polish and the smoothing to happen, then it had to travel. I don't imagine somebody sitting down, getting them so perfectly like each other, or something like that. And then at the end, they were finally notched. So just a little bit about this kind of caching behavior. None of that is utilitarian. Nothing about that is expedient. Nothing about that is like a quick making of sharp edges or something for piercing and throwing at a bison or anything like that. And when you make something that large and you notch the margins like that, anybody who's done anything like that or tried to use something like that, the risk for snapping that is so extraordinarily high. You don't even want to ding it. It'll ring like a tuning fork. Mcbride's smiling and he's like, I know what you mean. And if you try to make a long, wide, thin biface and you notch it from the margins, high risk, right? You get that split fracture like that. And the same is the case when you're notching in the base deeply into a biface. The most common error you're going to make is a split fracture, which is split right across the biface. But basically, the point here is that the human investment behind that is just so high in terms of source stone selectivity, the knowledge and skill to heat treat different kinds of cherts, right? Anybody who's done that kind of work knows that takes time. Just because it's Edwards chert doesn't mean it's all the same. you have to do a lot of experiments. Different woods, different kinds of woods, some burn hot, fast, some burn this and that way, so you've got to get things right. And the medium that you put them in, either if it's under ash, if it's in sand, whatever you use, you got to get everything just right to get the heat treatment just right, or you ruin it, and the whole thing is a failure. So anyway, that is simply not utilitarian. So the same with the lizard hill cache. Nothing about that is utilitarian, whimsical, and so on. The difference between the two, I would say, is that in the lizard hill cache, it's clearly not a burial, in the sense there's no skeletal remains or anything. You have a cairn on the hill and you have these large features. With the Denton Creek cache, you don't have any notes, how it was found and those kinds of things. I can clearly show how it's not like any kind of fake, but for sure it's maybe a burial implements. They're not meant to be brought back into service for any kind of procurement of meat or anything. So they either mark a place, or maybe there were burials that we didn't get to as professionals. Right? So maybe someday I'll be able to go to that location if some notes can be found and see what happened. But that kind of behavior, and I'm going to be mentioning that in an article that's going to be out coming soon, is very similar to some stuff that we see in Clovis times, something that we see also in the Upper Paleolithic and the Old World. So this kind of votive, symbolic kind of behavior in caching is also something that's interesting to see going all the way back into the Middle Archaic. It's been with humans for tens of thousands of years. And then on top of that, one thing I would say is that let's see. Okay. Again, just this roll of time. How we think about technologies, usually we see a point and we're imagining, wow, how long did it take them to do this? Well, it's really hard to say. A lot of the stuff that we find, a Martindale, or the F-150 Pedernales, or, a lot of these things are definitely churned out in great numbers and so on. But one thing that I always keep in mind is like a written account that I read years ago where a man was watching a native make blades off a pour of obsidian. And he had this big device where he was pressing blades off the pour. But before he did that, he had fasted for like 10 days. And if there was an error in the process of pushing off these blades, in other words, a blade came off and it broke in half, or it wasn't correct, it meant that he fasted incorrectly. So the meaning behind actions is really hard for us to understand. So I always keep these kinds of things to keep myself from sort of projecting too much upon the way things are done in the meaning systems. On the other hand, the problem solving, what the operational principles were to make the material form, that we can get at. We can map systems of reduction for every technology that we encounter. We lack that. So I'm working with a guy right now so that we can sort of like get those the mapping out of these technologies of all the major points in Texas. As a both to have experimental reference library material like the debitage, but also which can be comparatively good when you're analyzing assemblages. But wouldn't it be cool to not just have a typology book, but to have a technology book? How does that sound? So basically, I wanted to hopefully leverage some of the idealistic minds in the crowd, and it's such across a big spectrum of people, from first timers to veterans, and a lot of my peers are here, Lassen and Erik and people I look up to. But getting down the rabbit hole of some of these nerdy details is a little tough to thread in this situation. But at the same time, it's a way to share a perspective, a viewpoint, and a frame of reference on the material culture, the stone tool material. So when you see a flake, in my mind, it's like, oh, that was hammerstone, or that was this or that, and so on. I'm thinking technologically. It makes me, I have these funny thoughts in my head. Anybody remember that movie with Clint Eastwood, Firefox?
Yeah.
Remember what the jet wouldn't fire unless he thought in Russian. I remember, think in Russian, and then it would respond to his actions, and the missiles would fire because he stole the Soviet airplane. But anyway, it's like think technologically, and then we can, by thinking technologically, it pushes us to create methods to get at the behaviors, right? And that's kind of like what I wanted to impress upon. It's all about the behaviors. So if we could start getting behavioral patterns mapped out, not only having the morphological patterns mapped out, we can really, really get somewhere. Does that make sense? Out of all this rigmarole I just talked about. So I make some points here. Archaeological understanding of ancient cultures can be improved by high-resolution understandings, connecting attributes on chipstone artifacts with behaviors that produce them. That's sort of like the thing that I'm getting at. So thank you for listening to me a little bit, and please, if there's any questions or anything, fire away.
So through experimental archaeology, you're trying to understand the human behaviors. And what my question is that you're trying to replicate almost exactly their strike patterns and their techniques that they're trying to use to create these stone tools, right? So in your opinion, is it depending on the individual or the group in general that those particular strike patterns are and the technique is done?
If I understand the question, my answer would be that what we tend to see in the archaeological record is that in space and time there are specific systems of reduction that have taken hold culturally for some reason. Like this is the way we do it, and we have to think differently about that. It wasn't like somebody handed their grandkid the manual. That's not how it worked. You have to think more on oral transmission lineages. So it's demonstration. It's respecting the elder. It's an opening to seeing how it's done, how they stand, sit, manipulate their hands. One thing that's so important in making a technology is not only the percussive hand, but the receiving hand that's holding the raw piece. With your fingers and palm, you're actually manipulating how that flake releases. So you can control how flake lengths are. You can do a lot of things with the supporting hand, including holding it wrong right at the moment when you strike it and just wind up snapping it. So there's so many things in the observational and in identifying with the one that's doing it that was very much part of the past and more in this oral transmission way. So Clovis, Full Sun, Scott's Bluff, Angostura, Amdice, all these major technologies, they have a very stringent system of how it's done. Now, even within these big universal ways it's done, we find variation, but it's small, and it's, of course it's not the same across time. I mean, something very stringent across a huge geographic range like Clovis, from coast to coast, from the Great Lakes all the way down to Venezuela, something huge like that that's spread within a few centuries. It's so universal, it's kind of shocking how universal it is. But when you do a deep dive and start really looking at it, what's fascinating is how differently archaeologists define what Clovis is, and also how that relates to variability that can be found in the technology that we're analyzing. And then it becomes a mess, right? So that's why I think we need to get more down the rabbit hole of the flake scars, the technological behaviors and the technologies to parse out these patterns and groups and subgroups and subsets of a single technology and so on. But in space and time, yeah, you have these very strong systems that were graphs held, and there was some sort of meaning in that socioeconomic world that they had as hunter-gatherers.
So,
Dr.
which then ascribe some sort of either ethnic identity or there's some sort of social structure or ethnicity to it that you wouldn't necessarily have, like they wouldn't be going, I'm going to use the lane tree technology at this point. The idea is that these are long-held traditions or as you say, like a template that's being transmitted from intergenerationally, and that there does seem to be some sort of, we call it type, it has a place in time and space, and that we do see sort of different, as you point out, different technologies existing at the same time, sometimes overlapping.
Yeah, like in the Lizard Hill, you have two distinct technologies very deliberately put together. So slight technological overlap, but maybe a whole lot more cultural affinity. You know, it's partially getting to what you're saying, but yeah, I think there's so many complexities to that, as you know. Our dating sucks usually, you know, so it's really hard to nail down some of these technologies in time. And so sometimes we thought certain technologies lasted for 1,500 years. Oh, wait, it was maybe only 400. And that changes a whole lot of things. But yeah, I don't know, I'm not sure where it's going to go.
That's sort of,
yeah.
You know, and then if you're thinking that it's a transmission like that, is there something, I hate to make it organic, but there seems to be some sort of phylogenetic sort of deviation that occurs through time where there's sort of technologies we can trace traits that then seem to occur, or we have traditions that seem to change, where if you want to say Angus Thur to Hcaa, that's within tradition. You have gradations.
Sure.
You know, it's a continuum.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, there's a whole world waiting to get into when some more of you get involved into this. But there's something I was going to add on to that piggyback. Again, like I say with the Andes, the Calf Creek Horizon, that was a brief, it was a very brief horizon in time where that material culture is represented. And it seems to correspond with bison are back in the southern plains.
Well, what follows it, of course, is different technology.
Exactly.
Right.
So, cultural reasons, ecological, environmental reasons for changing, is the technology a response to, hey, they're back, or other things, or hey, look what I made today, guys, and then it just starts a whole inspiration for people. There's so many things we can kind of come up with, but it's hard to answer some of these things, and almost I would say impossible. I think we make it a really, it's a tough spot to put ourselves in to try to get into the head of somebody we can't. You know what I'm saying? But at the same time, we can. It's a little bit like observing a black hole. You can see the stars orbiting, but it's hard to actually see.
See the byproduct.
Yeah, you see the byproduct. So we're trying to infer certain things by that material evidence. I hate to use an astronomical example there. Sorry. Yes, to the right up here.
So, kind of follow up on that, do you think that it has a little bit to do with, like, maybe I really like this point and this technology, and that was maybe their passion, favorites, points and technologies that they can hold together, or do you think it's more like a technological manual, like we had to pass on some really great information on how to do something to someone new like me? What tools would you put in there to show this is how it's done? Is there a feeling one way or the other?
Yeah, that still blows my mind. It's like having the manual, and it's almost like it was deliberately put there as some sort of storage of information. And I hate to creep into that territory because someone get tomatoes thrown at me, but you're still left with the technological continuum being there. So then somebody else tell me what that means, right? Based on the evidence of the skill of the napper that did the rest of the late phase work and the finishing work, they could have done the other few, within 10 minutes. They've done, and then get into their ritual or whatever it is in that sacred space. They did not. You have the earliest reduction all the way to the end in basically 11 pieces. So why was that done so deliberately with the whole surrounding context, on the hill and such care? So is it a new type of caching behavior? Maybe, maybe not. But these are things we have to think about as we look in at the behaviors of technology. Yeah, but I don't, on which side of the fence it is, maybe this is just the coolest thing. Hey, this marks my people. Let's keep it as long as we can. And then the grandson says, oh, that's crap, he wants to make something else. I don't know how those things go. But I'm always looking for primary causes or secondary causes for technology to appear and so on, and what came before and what came after it, and seeing how designs may have led to other designs and so on. That's, look at the Middle Archaic, Pedernales, Boulevardy, Nolan, Travis, there's so many things that have some overlapping forms and technology, but they're also quite distinct. Anyway.
And it's in Kerrville, Tennessee.
Castroville?
Yeah. I mean, there's different space and time. The farm is Tennessee. Do you think that has anything to do with the way the projectile work from the bison?
How the projectile point work on the
bison come back around the Kerrville.
Oh, like if Castroville is related to bison?
Yeah.
Ah, okay.
Thinking it might work.
So,
to do with killing technology.
Right. So did other forms in the late archaic, middle transition to late archaic relate to bison presence? Is that part of the question? Yeah, and maybe Erik can say more to this, but we do kind of have a presence-absence flow generally in archaeological sites for bison, and in the later archaic, there's, when you look at Montel, Castroville, and so on, and the few investigations that I've done, I have seen bison bone in relation to Montel and Castroville. Erik,
Yeah, it's the same. That was kind of an axiom. You have these big wide blade projectile points at the, with the overabundance, you'd say more of abundance of bison, because I don't do periods where bison are actually non-existent per se. It must reach some threshold or something where it makes you change your technology. And there's two sort of rules of that. One is the really abundant, you change your technology to process to kill bison and slaughter and basically process. The other thing sometimes, if they're very rare, but you have a symbolic reason or you're really after them, you sometimes have a specialized technology that makes sure if you come across a bison, you kill it. You're able to kill it. It's a risk sort of a model on it as well.
Right, so it gets into the lethality of what you're making. If you have something with a huge blade cross section, a lot of surface area, you get into the main organs and it's just sitting there as it runs, just cutting the insides. The amount of seconds it takes to drop the bison kind of means something.
But they're usually in association too. You have another toolkit with to butchering. You have scrapers and you have knives.
There was a question over here on this.
Yeah, I mean, mine is more of a technical question. I'm interested as to since this type of experimental archaeology gives insight into an additional perspective and insight into these people. Why more archaeologists
Well, yeah, well, that's a, anybody got some coffee? It's, there's so many reasons for that. You know, there was such an emphasis on establishing chronologies in Texas, and one great way of doing that is establishing these typologies. You know, and a great, quick, general way of doing that is sorting them through shapes and sizes, and not really getting into the plate and all that stuff. But there's so many reasons. I'll just say a few. There's also sort of the weakness or the inherent difficulties in bringing in experiment in this capacity, because, and in a lot of cases in the past, it was not done maybe in such a great way that the overwhelming majority of the field thought it was like viable as a scientific approach. My sort of response to that is there's been so much oversimplification of the ancient individual and hunter-gatherers of the past by the typology, that if you bring in laboratory experiment in the process and go into a behavior approach, you can't do any of those things already been done. So bring the camps together, you know, synthesize, bring the statistics, bring the behavior, bring the experiment all together, and maybe we can get somewhere. So it's basically kind of like, you know, like Laskin and myself and John Kieran and Bruce Bradley and some other people that are in the experimental world to do methods in a way that sort of like the culture of archaeology, the professionals will take it seriously instead of saying, oh, there's the conceit of the flint knacker again, just because he breaks stone, he has the window and the truth, blah, 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 blah. You know, I'm quoting some literature.
Right.
Robert's nodding his head, I know that one. Yes.
You ever do like a residue analysis on your methods?
No, can you help me?
I went to the University of Oregon methods, we're doing a little analysis on their
Yeah, there's different kinds of sort of microanalysis that I would like to be done. That's one. Another one is it possible to extract in those micro spaces in the crystalline structure? Because even in not even at a super high power, I can see soil grains and other.
Hair. We have a hair jacket in Angus Sterling.
There you go. You know, there's like a reddish. There's a reddish soil and stuff, and I'm like, is this an ochre? You know, I don't know, but specialists, right? Getting the specialists together is yeah. So let's talk about some of those things. It's possible.
We find mastic. We know they're using adhesives and binding techniques, and we do find those residues. A lot of it is lipids. We use Chris Lynch knows this. We use lipids in Texas for years. And honestly, the initial test used to always be you get results back. We were using a burn rock, and it was corn, beaver, and black ebony or something like that. You got these rather ambiguous or generalized results. It's much more refined now. And a lot of that came with the original technologies. We were taking stuff that was done on ceramics in like Jordan or something like sealed ceramics, where you get rather precise identifications on things like human dairy or a type of fish. And we're applying that to these open field settings where we're doing things that are thousands of years old, and we have, and the taphonomy and the natural environment, we weren't sure, and still aren't sure in many cases, what the natural effects are that can create. If we get an answer, we're not sure if we're getting the right answer, and that goes, it's like radiocarbon dating. We get a date, but sometimes we don't know what did we actually get that led to these answers. And we're much better at figuring out levels of contamination. For Sergio's work, things that we're doing in dating are possible because we've refined methods of dating animal bones. And we get very precise answers on that. And that brings us to like John Lose's work on andite specifically, where I think he's advocating maybe a tighter time range.
Yeah.
For 8 years, not 8 years, but a very tight range of occupation.
Yeah.
or a flourishing of that particular technology, that it is a snapshot in time. And then it's sort of like, what happens to it? What happens to the record? Like with Sergio, you have all the people that have followed Sergio's methods, and they know how to fling that, and they do this one, and then all of that just disappears, and a new technology comes in. Is it those people that they just up and change, or we don't really know what, in some cases, what happened.
Right, and that's why we look at maybe some technological patterns transferring to maybe something that closely follows, like you have Andice, maybe that's close to that as Taylor and early triangulars, and these kinds of things. And there is some plating technology that is similar.
And to bring up also the importance of experimental work, I mean, the classic ones were like Daryl with the Dibble's work, Harold Dibble's work, where in the Neolithic they had all these types of scrapers, and they gave up, and they came with a million different typology names for it. And he just said, you take this one thing and you just reduce it to a bunch of its lifespan, and it goes through these stages in its lifespan, and it's the same artifact, it's just been worn down. And that's, if you look at the early 1950s, you look at the original Sun and Jelks book, and then you look at what we do now, a lot of the types originally, and they're doing their best, are in some cases just really worn down versions of a different type of coin. And so he's right in that we had an overemphasis on, because to be fair, a lot of the reason we had an overemphasis is that sometimes that's all we got. We got a bunch of projectile points, and they mean something. And it's only, I'd say, in the last 20 years of systemic radiocarbon dating, and then examining these sites to determine, are they worthy, or is it worth the effort we're putting into, because are we looking at disturbed components or true components? And that is probably the hardest. And all you hear are students, or you're trying to do research, sometimes you find there's like 3 examples across the state that you can read the literature on for the problem that you have. And so we have a horrible dearth of information, of reliable information, even after the amount of work that we've done. And it's incremental. And everything Sergio was just talking about is going to be on the level point. So we're going to be adding that, we're going to have a supplemental form, and you'll be filling that out, 2 of them for level.
And my new detail.
One other thing I was going to say real quick relating to your question is, there is a strong emphasis from a lot of my peers and professors also to be very mathematical. It's like you got to have it in there to look scientific, almost. It's like almost that strong. But if you ask, well, is it necessary? It's like, what are the goals here? What are you trying to answer, right? What do you really want to answer? I want to know what the scientific question is, right? Okay. So there's so many things involved in this, but at the same time, experimental work is really difficult. It's really, really hard, and it's not. Nobody has any absolute answers. It's not about giving absolute answers. But the one great thing about experimental work is if it's done in a controlled way, and if it's done well, you can demonstrate what operationally works to produce certain plate scars and traits and products and so on. So when you're establishing analytical categories in reports and what they mean and so on, you can back it up and show and demonstrate what operationally works and tie that to, like ancient behaviors and so on. This is kind of what it's about in a nutshell. Does that make any sense? So that's, no question.
Yeah, you mentioned earlier about I believe an indigenous worker, said that he'd been fasting for 10 days before he was going to start making his plate or whatever it was.
Yeah.
Right, so I'm wondering if in experimental archaeology is anybody examining the role of mysticism? Totally intangible, but.
Well, how do you define that?
Well, there you go. How do you define mysticism? Okay, religion or the other, the belief of the other. Spirituality.
Well, in terms of experimental archaeology, if you do enough of it, because you're basically the whole archaeological record of humans and their ancestors are there for you. That's like your playground, right? So everything from Australopithecines on to modern, Homo sapiens sapien, the last, 7 million years, well, I better bring that back to maybe about 5 million years and so on, is interesting, from a paleo-neurological development level. And then when you hit the actual physical stone tool record about 3.2 million years ago to now, that's your playground. So there's a whole lot of stuff in there that, once you start getting into like the more advanced technologies that relate to modern man and the middle and upper Paleolithic stuff, things like sites that might relate to astronomical markers and even PET stone tool technologies on walls and near astronomical alignment sites, and that can kind of creep into your work, and you have to consider those things. But there again, the Lizard Hill cache, it's so almost ritual oriented, right? Or as like Andrea Old from the Center for Big Good Study calls it, it's done in the sacred space, like in quotes. That's how she looks at it. It's sort of like, that's her interpretive operating narrative to it. It is more in this realm that is sort of like the cognitive operational framework for those technological behaviors. Makes some sense. So yeah, some of those things come into it, but I mean, again, the main engine behind what you're doing is sort of trying to see what operationally works, like what are the actual behaviors and so on. But you have to bring in all these theoretical things into it, otherwise your experimental work doesn't have that much validity or depth of thought. You have to bring in cognitive anthropology, ethnoscience, problem solution, systems thinking, all these kinds of things that come into like, how you incorporate your methods and draw your methods up and how you report on it. And you have to think about something that's just so deeply human about us too. We're not robots, right? We have this inner world of meaning, and it's basically conceptual and it's emotional and so on. So people that get so far down the rabbit hole of like sterilizing lithics or other kinds of things and removing that sort of human factor out, I don't like so much. So some people might take a question and say, oh, and roll their eyes or something. But it also sort of, sort of like on purpose and consciously removing something that's just kind of inherent to our human psyche in a way. Or we can kind of deny some of these things and hopes and fears and all kinds of things and so on. But if you follow some of the work of like what's going on with the cave art in Texas and all these kinds of things, you can get some really good interpretive work going on, and kind of see how a human ancient mind experiences that context that they're in, not so different from nature, but a part of it, and integrated with everything that's moving and around them and so on, the stars, the seasons, and everything. So for some people that might be mystical. For some people that's just nature. So there's so many things that go into that. What we might call mystical and what we might call, well, that's just really being intimate with the processes and seeing that one is just interdependent with those processes. So, anyway.
But you do get, let's say you take like Mayan eccentrics.
Oh yeah, there you go, Mayan eccentrics.
There's a type of flint knapping that is totally imbued with mysticism or spirituality.
Yeah.
You don't understand necessarily what it is, but
yeah.
I think, like Francois was saying, it's like how much can that be viewed in the typical F-150?
Right. It depends on the owner of it.
And that has to do with, we do find artifacts that have no practical, they would be great, like we said.
Yeah.
You said you've got one cache that's not for storage.
But not for use. I mean, it was, some of the stuff that we did break, if it was ever utilized, and that's, it's like great, like you said, great goods and things like that, we know, in some cases are practical. They're representative of something.
Yeah, and one thing I didn't mention about the Lizard Hill cache is the use-ware and half-ware. I did do that on that, and there was 0 on those, so they were never used on those Mcbride points in the Lizard Hill cache. So they were made very. So yeah, so even caching, sometimes we define that as a different thing. You know. But anyway, any other questions before we go down that whole thing? Everybody's ready to open that bottle of whiskey that was back there. Thanks a lot, guys. That was good.
No, yeah, what Sergio's work is, it's absolutely fascinating. And Dr. Lasney is also a practitioner of that type of technology. And so it's a necessary skill. It's just incredibly intensive. I mean, well, there you have it, yeah. And, you know, in the program I'm in, you know, we have many, you know, Chris Ringstaff is another experimental practitioner, and a lot of it goes to making it a science. You know, he does time and motion studies, really, so we can come up with, you know, we have a lot of misconceptions over how long it takes to do something, and we used to think, oh, this must be really hard for him. I know Sergio, because sometimes, you know, it's like, hey, that was 15 minutes, and before we're thinking, oh, it must take that was really significant, and in some cases. We're just looking at the stone technology. There's the whole wood technology and everything else that supports that stone technology. And there's something to be said about all the consistency we see, almost mechanical consistency of certain metrics in terms of hafting, is that somebody had to make all those damn wood tools that it always could automatically fit those halves. And in some cases, it's the shaft that, like, if you look at, you know, I looked at sawn material and stuff, and it's the expensive investment is in the shafts, well, the bow itself, but they had these little sockets for the points because they used to just make points out of hammered nails and just wrap them on. But they wanted to recover the arrow itself. That was the main, they carried 3 arrows and about 10 shafts, little mini shafts that they'd socket into it. That's the investment. Was in some cases for them, it was in the whole tool. So we're looking at just, these things are part of a bigger system. It's a whole system that, you know, that we're looking at. And yeah, there might be, for all we know too, that there's also, to throw something to Francois about it, there could be also a spiritual aspect to the crafting of all the material, the toolkit that goes with it. But again, it's hard to experiment on. We can experiment on what we're doing, and Sergio also, you know, I make a lot of those tables I hate, you know, because we do length, width, thickness, and that's one thing we know how to record. But it's hard to get from those metrics to why is that significant? What does it mean? What are they doing with it? Chris Lynch was saying too, is like sometimes we measure the wrong things. You know, big surprise there. We get obsessed on, you know, we're missing the whole point of, yes, we record all these things on the stone tool, but so what? What was it making? I mean, that's it, that tool was being used to do something else that we don't see. Well, it costs a lot, Sergio. We pay, I know, I'm on the contract side of a lot of this work. And we're trying to make it better. I mean, we are, in the past 10 years or so, we're trying to focus and target every site. And, you know, as I said yesterday, we can't solve everything at Bear Creek site, but we can get a lot of really good data on it. But we're not going to solve all these issues of mobility and people moving around. And what you should take out of it, and what Sergio was saying too, is that when you find this diversity, the idea is we have a melding probably of all these different groups that occur at different times at these sites. And that itself is fascinating. That's telling us people were highly mobile. People were moving around the landscape, and people had they selected certain materials intentionally, and they knew where those materials were. So there's a lot of probably tradition that was occurring, and that goes hand in hand with their with these technological traditions. And there's something that's amazing about how consistent a lot of these technologies are across parts of Texas and through time. And then, of course, until they're replaced by something else. And again, we're still not sure in many cases why that occurs. So, but anybody have anything to add? Or look forward to digging tomorrow.
Yes, sir.
It'll be nice soft digging. Marvin, like I said, soften it up for y'all. So I'm going to get extra level forms printed up. So we're going to need them. Thank you all. Thank you, Sergio.